Here's something I want you to sit with for a second. You started your book with fire. You knew your characters, you felt the story pull you forward. And then, somewhere around chapter maybe 10 or 15, that feeling disappeared. And the pages are still coming, but they feel a bit hollow. Your characters might be moving, but nothing actually feels like it really matters to them. And your brain has started whispering the worst possible thing it could whisper at this point, and that is, maybe this story just isn't good enough. And I want you to hear me clearly when I say this. That is not a story problem. That is a brain problem. And more specifically, it's a structural problem with a very specific psychological cause that almost every writer hits at the midpoint. And that has nothing to do with your talent, your commitment, or whether this book deserves to exist. Today, we're going to get into exactly what's happening in your brain and in your manuscript when the second act stalls. And I'm going to give you a framework to fix it that works with your personality, not against it. So stay with me. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Madison Michaels, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Write the Darn Book. I'm your host, Madison Michaels, and today we're going deep into that messy middle. You know, the part of your novel that defeats you sometimes more than the blank page ever does. We're talking about that sagging second act, what causes it, and why your brain makes it so much harder than it needs to be. We're also going to go in how to diagnose and fix your messy middle using a structural framework that I've built specifically around the way different writers are wired. So whether you're a plotter whose outline has stopped serving you or a pantser who wrote themselves into a fog, this episode is for you. I want to start with something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. You're sitting at your desk, the document is open, and you know, because you've been here enough times now to recognize it, that what you're about to write is going to feel wrong. Not technically wrong, not I don't know what happens next wrong, just flat, like writing with the color drained out of it. You produce the scene, the characters do things, words appear on the page, and when you read it back, there's this hollow quality to it that you can't quite name, but you feel it immediately. Most writers in this place do one of two things. They push harder, so more words, more sessions, more willpower, grinding through the middle, hoping the energy comes back on its own, or they stop. They tell themselves they need more time, more inspiration, a better idea, perhaps a different approach. They open a new document. They start something else. The manuscript goes into a folder where it joins the others. What almost no writer does, because almost no one tells them this, is to stop and ask the right questions. Not, am I talented enough to pull this off? And not, maybe this idea was never good enough. Those questions keep you circling in this circle of self-blame and going nowhere. The actual questions that you have to ask yourself and that are very worth asking are, what is my brain responding to right now? And what is my story telling me it needs? And honestly, do I need to revisit where this plot is actually going is another one that are very productive questions to ask. They treat the problem as a problem to be solved rather than as evidence of a personal failing. Because here's what I know from working with writers at every stage and from my own experience with writing manuscripts too, when they've gone flat, is that the sagging middle is almost never a creativity problem. It's not even primarily a structure problem, though structure is a part of the fix. It's a neuroscience problem. It's a personality problem. And until you understand what's happening underneath the flat pages, no amount of craft advice is going to give you back your story. So that's where we're going today. We're going to understand what's actually happening in your brain and in your nervous system and in your manuscript, and then we're going to fix it. I want to tell you first about a draft that fell apart on me at about chapter 15. It was a historical thriller, strong premise, characters I genuinely loved. And the first 10 chapters came really fast. I was in that flow state where the story felt like it already existed somewhere, and I was just finding it and bringing it into the world. That kinesthetic aliveness in the writing where you feel the scene before you even write it, and where the characters just are so alive and real and the words feel inevitable. And then chapter 15 arrived and something changed. I can still remember sitting at my desk and feeling the difference in my body before I could name it intellectually. The writing felt like lifting instead of flowing. I'd open the document and my nervous system would do this subtle thing, a slight pulling back, a tightening across my chest. And I told myself that was just tiredness or distraction or the fact that I had a lot on my plate that week. So I kept writing. 3 weeks of pages that felt completely hollow. I added a subplot. I introduced a new secondary character. I rewrote the same chapter from 3 different points of view, and I was doing all the things that look like writing, but underneath all of it was the truth that I just couldn't see. And it was that I'd lost the thread of the story and I just didn't know where it had gone. The story that I was telling myself during those 3 weeks is the part I really want you to hear most. Because I wasn't telling myself that this was a structural problem. No, I was telling myself that, maybe this story isn't as strong as I thought. I was also telling myself, maybe I'm not the right person to write this. Maybe I can't write this. Maybe I'm not good enough. So it was this particular brand of self-doubt that generally appears in that midway point of a story, not necessarily at the beginning when everything is possible and not at the end when you actually see the finishing line, but in that murky middle stage where the initial excitement for the story has spent itself and the ending is not close enough and it feels just so full away that it doesn't have that pull forward for you yet. My brain had done what brains often do when the familiar reward of forward momentum disappears. And it went looking for a thread to explain the discomfort. But the thread it landed on was me and my abilities, my story, my right to even be writing at all. That moment shifted everything when what I did was stop writing and I started asking myself different questions. Not the, am I good enough to finish this questions, and not the, is this story worth continuing type of questions, but the questions that actually helped to move me forward instead of questions that kept me stuck. When you start asking questions about it being all about you rather than the work, that is going to keep you stuck in the middle and potentially putting the manuscript away completely. The questions that actually moved me forward and will move you forward too were, what is my brain responding to right now? Or it could be, what is my story telling me that it needs at this point? And potentially even, do I need to look again at where the plot is going? Those are useful questions. They point outward towards the manuscript rather than inward towards your adequacy as a writer. And when I looked at my manuscript through that lens, not as a talent problem, But as a neuroscience and structure problem, I could see exactly what had happened. The engine had stalled, and it wasn't because the story was broken, but because I hadn't built the specific kind of forward tension that a second act requires. And once I saw that clearly, the fix was so simple and straightforward. It took about a fortnight, and thankfully it didn't involve a rewrite, just a recalibration. And that hollow feeling in my writing disappeared almost immediately because my brain finally had the structural scaffolding it needed to feel safe moving forward. Now, I share this with you not because your situation is identical to mine, but because the pattern is almost universal. The sagging middle is a craft problem on the surface. Underneath, though, it's what your nervous system does when the story loses its structural engine. And the way back is understanding both. So let's start with what's actually happening in your brain, because this matters before we get to any structural tools. Your brain runs on prediction. It's constantly using past experiences to predict what comes next, and it rewards itself with dopamine when its predictions are confirmed. This is why the first act or first component of your novel feels just so electric and alive to write. Everything is new, every scene is a discovery, and your brain is getting a steady stream of novelty reward just from the act of creating. The inciting incident, the character introductions, the world building, all of that is fresh territory, and fresh territory is neurologically exciting. The third act also has its own neurological fuel, and that's the resolution. Your brain can feel the ending approaching, and the predictions are converging, and the pattern is completing. There's a different kind of dopamine hit in closure and in the satisfaction of threads being tied all up. The second act, though, has neither of those advantages. The novelty of the opening has worn off, the resolution of the ending isn't close enough to feel yet, and your brain, which is always scanning for threat, can start to read the absence of those rewards as a warning signal. It starts thinking, oh, something is wrong, something is unsafe, the work is too hard, or the story is too broken, or worse, that you aren't capable of writing it. But that's not the truth. That's just your threat detection system filling a neurological vacuum with a story that feels more manageable than I need to do some structural work now. Understanding this reframes the whole experience. The flat feeling in your second act is not evidence that something is wrong with your story. It's your nervous system's predictable response to a structural gap. And when you know that, you can stop arguing with yourself about whether the story is good enough and start doing the actual work. Here's where it gets more specific, because the way the second act stalls looks different depending on your writing personality. And if you've taken the bird writing personality quiz on my website, just visit madisonmichaels.com/quiz if you haven't. But if you have, what I'm about to say will likely feel very familiar. Dove writers, they're the warm, empathetic, emotionally connected writers to their characters. They tend to stall in the second act for a very specific reason, and it's because they've lost the emotional thread. Doves write from feeling first, and when the middle of the manuscript becomes structurally complex or plot heavy, the emotional resonance that they depend on starts to thin out. A dove in a stalled second act often doesn't know they have a structure problem. They know they've lost the feeling of the story or the characters, and they say things like, I can't connect with my characters anymore, or the story doesn't feel alive. The fix for a dove writer is to find the emotional heartbeat of each scene before trying to fix the plot logic of the story. Now, our writers, the analytical, thorough, system-orientated writers, often stall because their outline has reached its limits. Remember, owls are usually planners and they can take a plan a very long way. But when the plan runs out or the story has deviated from it, an owl's second act can seize up almost completely. They may go back and over-revise earlier chapters rather than pushing forward into uncharted territory. Because remember, uncharted territory without a plan feels genuinely unsafe to an owl brain. The fix for an owl writer is permission to rebuild the map, not to abandon structure, but to re-establish it from where they currently are in the manuscript. Peacock writers, the creative, energetic, ideas-driven writers, have a second act problem that often looks like the opposite of a block. A peacock in the messy middle typically isn't stuck. They're writing, but what they're writing has started to drift away from the story's core, pulled by a new idea or a new subplot or new characters or new possibilities for the story. So the second act sags not because nothing is happening for a peacock writer, but because too much is happening, and none of it with enough structural intention. A peacock writer needs to find the spine of the story again and have the discipline to serve it. Now, eagle writers, our goal-focused, decisive, results-orientated writers, often hit that messy middle wall because they've been writing towards an outcome without adequately building the interior life of the story. Remember, eagles tend to move fast, and the second act requires slowing down for the internal, psychological, emotional work that gives a climax its weight. An eagle's second act can feel thin. Plot events can be happening, but the reader isn't accumulating the emotional investment that makes those events matter. The fix for an eagle writer is to go deeper into character interiority. So that means the inner world of the character, their feelings, their emotions, not broader into the plot. Now, please keep in mind that none of these are fixed diagnoses. Most writers are a blend of different personality types, and your tendencies will shift across projects. But knowing your primary pattern gives you a much faster route to understanding what your specific second act needs. So take what resonates with you. If you've done the quiz and it came up perhaps that you're an eagle writer, but it feels more like the owl fix might be something you need to incorporate into your messy middle, then do that. Go with what feels intuitively right for you, because remember, the online quiz does have its limitations. It's not the full personality quiz that I do with my coaching clients, but it gives you an indication. But always go with what feels right for you internally, all right? And use whatever does feel as though it could potentially work. And if it doesn't, try one of the other fixes, all right? And that is how you will start to work out what works for you and how you are uniquely wired. Now let's get structural, my friends, because personality awareness alone won't fix a sagging second act. You also need to understand what the middle of your novel is architecturally designed to do and why it requires a different kind of tension to the acts on either side of it. The framework rests on one central principle. Every act in your novel needs a different kind of tension. Not just more tension, but a different kind. If you run the same quality of tension through all three acts, the middle will feel repetitive, even if the plot events are entirely different. Your reader's nervous system needs the tension to change in character, not just in intensity. In the first act, the tension is primarily external and anticipatory. Something's wrong or approaching, and the protagonist doesn't fully understand it yet. The reader senses the threat before the character does. This is the tension of setup, exciting because it's new. In Act 3, the tension is external and urgent. Everything's in motion. The outcome is uncertain, but resolution is imminent. This is the tension of confrontation, and it's exciting because it's immediate. In Act 2, however, the tension needs to be internal and escalating. And this is the part most writers either underwrite or skip entirely in favour of more plot events. The second act is where your protagonist confronts not just the external problem of the story, but the internal problem of who they are, what they believe, what they fear, what they're protecting themselves from, and what it's going to cost them personally to see this through. The best second acts hold both threads simultaneously. External events that keep the plot moving and internal pressure that keeps deepening the character's psychological and emotional stakes. When a second act sags, it's almost always because one of those two threads has gone missing. Either the external events have become repetitive, variations of the same scene with slightly different details, or the internal pressure has been abandoned entirely in favour of plot mechanics. So the character's moving through events without being genuinely changed by any of them. Now that brings us to what I call the escalating consequence method. And this is the practical tool that I use to diagnose and rebuild a second act. And it works whether you're a plotter, a pantser, or somewhere in between. The principle is straightforward. In every scene of your second act, the consequence of failure for your protagonist should be measurably higher than it was in the previous scene. Not dramatically and not explosively higher every single time. That creates a different problem where the story feels exhausting and overwrought, but it has to be incrementally, consistently a little bit higher each time. So each scene should cost the protagonist something, and that cost should accumulate. Here's how to apply it in 3 steps. The first step is to identify your protagonist's core want and their core fear. And these are different, but both matter. The core want is that conscious external goal, to solve the mystery perhaps, to win a love, or to save their family. Whatever the plot is driving towards, that's their external core goal. Now, the core fear is that unconscious internal threat. It could be their inner fear of being abandoned or being exposed as inadequate. It could be losing control or being responsible for somebody else coming to harm. A strong second act puts increasing pressure on both the core want and the core fear simultaneously. External events threaten the want, internal moments expose the fear. Now, step 2 is to map your second act scenes against those 2 tracks. So go through every scene you've written or planned and ask 2 questions about each one. Firstly, does this scene meaningfully change the protagonist's proximity to their external goal, either moving them closer or further in a way that raises the stakes? And secondly, does this scene put genuine pressure on my protagonist's core fear, requiring some kind of internal response? If a scene can't answer yes to at least one of those questions, it doesn't belong in the second act in its current form. Now, step 3 is apply the escalation test. So look at that cumulative shape of both tracks across the full second act. Is the external pressure genuinely building, or does it plateau? Is the internal cost becoming more personal and more irreversible as the act progresses? And by the midpoint of your novel, roughly the centre of the second act, your protagonist should be facing a situation that they couldn't have imagined at the end of Act 1. And critically, the reason it feels impossible shouldn't just be external circumstances, It should be what continuing is asking of them internally. Now, how you work with this framework will depend on your writing personality and your NLP modality. So that's the way you naturally access and process your creative world. If you're a visual writer, you'll likely find it much more useful to literally map your 2 tracks on paper, draw a timeline perhaps of your second act and mark each scene with an E for external or an I for internal, and you'll be able to see the pattern and the gaps in a way that a written list won't necessarily give you. So visualize the shape of the tension before you start fixing it. If you're an auditory writer, talk it through. Narrate your second act out loud to yourself as if you're telling someone the story. Where do you lose your own attention? Where does your voice go flat? Your ear will catch the structural problems before your analytical mind identifies them. If you're a kinesthetic writer, trust your body signals. When you map your scenes and one of them gives you that slight pulling away feeling or that subtle resistance in your chest, that the scene is the one that needs work, listen to that. Your felt sense is an extraordinarily reliable diagnostic tool when you learn to read it rather than override it. And if you're an auditory digital writer, someone who processes through systems, logic, and internal analysis, the framework that I've described will feel most natural to you in a written systematic form. So build the map methodically. The logic of the structure will show you exactly where the engine has stalled. So whichever way you approach it, the goal is the same, to give your brain the structural scaffolding that it needs to feel safe moving forward. Because that hollow feeling in your writing, that resistance, the flatness, that's your nervous system telling you that the road isn't fully built yet. So build the road and the writing will flow back. Here's your homework before you write another scene in your current manuscript. Go to your middle, and whether that's the chapters you've already written or an outline or a rough sense of what's supposed to happen in the middle of your book, and then identify your protagonist's core want and their core fear, then map your scenes against those 2 tracks using the approach that fits your writer wiring. So either draw it visually, talk it aloud, feel your way through it, or write it as a systematic list. Ask whether each scene is doing work on at least one of those tracks and apply the escalation test. Is the consequence of failure genuinely building both externally and internally from scene to scene? Most writers find at least one place where one track has gone completely quiet. And that's not failure. That is just where the work is. And knowing specifically where it is means you're no longer fighting a vague feeling. You're actually solving a concrete problem. So map your second act before your next writing session. That's the work. My friends, I hope today has been really valuable for you and has given you some tips and tricks and techniques that you can use to help you push through that messy middle. Now, everything we've talked about today, you can start applying on your own, and I encourage you to. But for those of you who want to go deeper and would like some support when they do so, that is what writing coaching is for. Now, I work through these frameworks with you to tailor the frameworks to your specific book and your specific writing personality. And that is a different approach and experience to just listening alone can give you. If you are keen to explore that with me, start with a free 15-minute clarity call. Just book it in, head to madisonmichaels.com/call and book in your free chat with me. I would genuinely love to talk to you about how I can help you structure your roadmap to get your book written. It's no pressure, no sales. It's just a genuine conversation where we discuss whether we both think we might be a fit to work together. So I do encourage you to take that step. And remember, my friends, You are the vessel for the story. So just relax and let the words flow through you and onto the page. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode, and let's write the darn book together. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.